From Los Angeles, you're listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. Hey y'all, my name is Helen Garcia, my pronouns are she, her, and you're listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. Yellow Chair Collective is a private practice based in Los Angeles, California, and today we have one of our fellow therapists, Khai Hoang, on the show. We discuss topics like perfectionism, overcoming struggles, imposter syndrome, and how to deal with things when they don't go your way. I'm going to get out of your way and introduce you to today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoy episodes like these, do us a favor, like, subscribe the podcast, share this with a friend. It helps us align with our mission to provide better mental health education for folks that may not be ready for therapy and want more information moving forward. So thanks so much for listening. Without further ado, let's start today's episode.
There's so much pressure to have to prove that you are doing the right, either for yourself or for the world, right? I have to prove that I'm a professional. I have to prove that I'm an adult. I have to prove that I'm, accomplished and using my time wisely, right? There's such a, not universal, but I think a big social tendency to want to find what's the perfect morning routine, right? What's the salary I'm supposed to have? What's the living situation? How many kids? How many, date nights? Whatever it sort of is. But I think there's so much pressure for that. And in a similar way, I do the to-do list thing.
I relate.
Like, this is how I know, right?
Yeah.
That I'm on top of things, right? And really quick, I was speaking to a mentor who sort of shared that it's also true for people who are sort of minoritized in spaces where that pressure to sort of perform or prove in that way gets kind of stronger.
Wow.
There's this pressure to feel like, oh, well, because I'm minority in this space, I'm queer in this space, I'm Asian in this space, I'm a woman in this space, whatever, someone's identity might be, sometimes it becomes a lot harder for us to want to trust, all of us, or trust our integrity, right? There's a lot of pressure to feel like, oh, I have to prove that I'm, a good therapist, a good son, a good partner, a good employee, whatever that might be, right?
That is so relatable.
Yeah, for a lot of us.
But I think it also questions this like black and white way that we live in society, especially as minorities. But I'm curious about like what forms of power, Khai, do you think you don't have when you walk into a space? And how does that affect the way that you perceive yourself and your qualifications as a person, not just a therapist?
That's a really great question. First and foremost, I am aware that I wield a lot of privilege in a lot of the spaces that I get to be in. Like,
sure.
In grad school, sort of like as one of the very, very few male presenting sort of students or male perceiving students, I was so aware of, feeling like I had to prove less to professor or prove less to a hiring agency, right? And some of my peers. And I think that's true in a lot of other areas, but that's my direct experience, right? For me, there are certain spaces where, as an Asian person, I find it really hard to feel proud of certain things or certain achievements or talk about my experience, right? There's such a pressure to behave humbly, expertise, or we distrust what we know, and we're more likely to show up in spaces and be like, well, I think it's like this, or like, yeah, I think I feel this way, instead of trusting, I have certain knowledge, right? Or you have certain knowledge. Which that can be kind of hard in certain spaces. And also just speaking up. I think there's also a tendency to fit into those spots of, oh, well, I'm going to be good at what I do, but I'm not going to rock the boat, right? I think there's a lot of that sort of experiencing within our communities.
I relate to that a lot. Like my first professional job, I was actually told by someone, and I won't name names, but they just looked at me up and down and they went, oh, you're cute and you're Asian. People will respect you more, but they won't respect the fact that you're young. And I think that like one of the hardest, I think that I want to frame this in a way where it wasn't that they said something that hurt me. It was that I was already thinking that about myself and it hurt 10 times more. And like there are things that I've labeled myself of, oh, I'm not this like strong, tall presence. I'm not a Victoria's Secret model, or I'm not X, Y, and Z. And so therefore I have no power and privilege in this space. And I love that you were vulnerable enough to bring this up, Khai, because I was actually talking to a Stanford psychologist yesterday who's become someone that I love talking to. She's going to be on the podcast in the next, probably the episode before yours, but she was telling me that as a queer female who like never really felt included in spaces, the fact that she was the president of the Asian American Psychological Association and she was a Stanford psychologist meant nothing. She still felt like that small person entering a room, that even though she had the label president, it didn't automatically take away all of the woundings that she felt like she still continued to need healing from. And I'm curious about what that looks like for you, because I hear you acknowledging all of the perceived powers that other people see in you, but what is it that you think that you are continuing to heal from when it comes to the power you don't think you have?
Right. Wow. That's a great question. It made me think about how you were talking about with this Stanford psychologist that I think it's very easy to want titles or things or indicators or like LinkedIn resumes to make us feel like we have an expertise or we have a sort of confidence, right?
Yeah.
But sort of like you're noticing, we show up in spaces and we continue to grow and we continue to have new thresholds of, oh, well, if I just got this next thing, right? It's not helpful, but I think it's such an easy way that we're conditioned, right? When you're a kid, it's if I just get a slightly better grade, or I do another assignment, or, you know, if I pass this test, if I get into this college, if I get this major, if I get this grad program, if I get this job, and it kind of never ends. And sort of like you're recognizing, I think the part that helps us sort of heal from this hurt is a sense of acceptance of self, right? As you're showing up, right? As a person of integrity, like you're talking about, where I understand I'm fallible, I need breaks, I'm allowed to mess up. I don't require comparison. I don't require comparison to validate my lifestyle, my behaviors, my off days, whatever it is, right? I think that's really, really huge. And I think sort of like you're asking, for me personally, I think growing up there was such pressure to meet certain standards socially, just in general. Right? I think I was super aware of the sort of model minority myth and, you know, wanting to do really, really good in school, but not wanting to make a fuss about it being really hard to be really, really good in school. And, you know, I don't mean to go on too much of a tangent, but I've worked a lot with I've worked a lot with middle schoolers and high schoolers and, you know, youth in my time as a therapist. And I see this additional layer of like social media pressure to be so perfect and to get to that next level and to prove yourself and to do that thing where it seems like self-acceptance is really, really, really hard. For young people especially, but for, you know, most people, if not everyone that I know, right, is that it's an ongoing sort of thing too.
Speaking of this like whole social media thing, do you think that kids have it harder now than we did when we were in high school?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, not to name names, but I was in a professional conversation once where somebody sort of asked if I believed that there was like a entitlement sort of generation growing. And I don't mean to put us too into rocky territory, but no, I absolutely think that the hyper awareness that people have about each other's lives and about how they present to each other, right? I think there's a hypersensitivity to, you know, how so-and-so speaks and dresses and does in school and messes up and, you know, plays a sport, or down to things like having acne or, you know, puberty being weird. And, you know, speaking for youth in general, but then there's also a lot of pressure and comparison of who their role models are or who they're sort of seeing and the lifestyles they sort of are being sold and the things that they're asked to like buy to be cool or whatever that might be, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's incredible pressure on young people as a result of being steeped in social media this way. And I also think that a lot of that is also true for people our age and older, just how we are growing to have a much, much greater awareness of I'm being like watched at all times, right?
Wow.
Not that it's legitimate, but we feel that way, right? And how we behave and how we don't give ourselves grace, or we find, you know, a lot of anxiety in how we show up in certain spaces, because there is such a sense of perception that I think isn't always helpful to what we're talking about in terms of self-acceptance and comfortability with how we show up genuinely, right?
I love what you said, the way that you described it, Khai, where you said there's such a hyper awareness right now in our society when it comes to just the way that we approach life, that I feel like I'm always being watched. But not only that, there's this complicated layer of I always have to be seen. And like, I think it's harder and harder now in today's culture to live a quiet life. Personally, because I can only speak for myself, I felt the immense pressure of that when Instagram came out when I was in high school. I think I was like a sophomore in high school when it came out. And I remember feeling weird that I had to share pictures that I took and all of my friends could see it. And it just felt really weird because I spent the last 16 years taking my own photos with like a camera.
Yeah.
But now I had to make it look good on my phone. And now when people ask me what my Instagram is, I actually deleted it last year just because I needed to feel less surveyed. And it gives people this like really weird look when I tell them that. But then they go, oh, good for you. I wish I had the courage to do that. And I was like, you still could, you just don't want to. But I'm curious about how you navigate that experience. Like, how do you counsel people going through that? But also, how do you navigate that for yourself? And no judgment if you do have social media, because that was just something I needed to do for myself.
I completely understand. Yeah. Well, social media for me right now is a lot of doom scrolling, unfortunately.
That's legit.
I've just like an awareness of, you know, so many things and so many people. And it is really, really, for me, it's been pretty suffocating sometimes to just be so steeped in this awareness, and it feels like a not helpful use of my time personally. But for the first part of your question, in terms of working with people who are experiencing this, I think so much of it has to do with examining in ourselves, you know, what we feel we're censoring or sort of editing or not comfortable sharing, and getting curious about it. For me, and I think for lots of people, it's about like our appearances, right? This photo, I look really, really good, and this photo, I don't look really, really good, and I would post this, I wouldn't post this, right? And it's a question about, you know, does it look like me, right? Like, is that me? And if so, what's uncomfortable about that, right? And I think for a lot of people, then we get to have a conversation about, well, I'm super aware of what beauty standards are for, you know, men or for women or for queer people, or, you know, I've worked with lots of clients who feel like their sort of expression doesn't align with maybe what they feel like is currently expected of, you know, a queer person or an Asian person or a man or a woman or whatever it might be.
Right.
And there's a hypersensitivity to that feels less about growth and wanting to curate parts of myself and be interested in parts of myself, but sort of a desire to change how I am to be more accepted.
Wow.
Right? As opposed to, is it possible that there's nothing wrong with me, right? I mean, this is a huge part of, I think, a lot of therapy that we do in general areas, but a lot of the time, the ways that I think people show up are very, very typical, safe responses to sometimes a very hostile and scary world, right? In terms of how we, you know, take care of ourselves. And what it can mean to sort of take a step back and be like, this is how I look, and I love that about me, or I want to wear this, and it's what I really, really like, and I enjoy it. I'm simplifying here, but that piece of acceptance, I think, is huge for people.
I love that. You pointed something out that I think is looming underneath the surface when it comes to having a presence online, where we're vulnerable to a point. But there's also a level of guilt that comes with, why am I not accepting who I am? Why do I feel the need to filter this? Yeah. But I think if you were to give it perspective, like, there are just certain things that are okay not to share online.
Really?
And sometimes having a photo of yourself that you don't want to post is okay. You don't have to take another photo, and you don't have to share that memory outside of what you experienced with that group. And there's almost like a level of privacy that comes with that. But I think it also speaks to this need of having boundaries around what you feel comfortable sharing. And I'd love for you to speak on that. I feel like there are a lot of people that do feel that pressure, even people that are our age, that want to feel expressive. You know, I work with a lot of creatives, and there is this need to post their art on Instagram, or to share what they're doing on LinkedIn, or to create this really artistic YouTube video.
Yeah.
But there's almost this fear of, am I sharing too much, or am I sharing just enough? Speak to those boundaries. Like, what are some tools that people can use to know what appropriate boundaries are okay in certain spaces, or how someone can identify what their boundaries are?
Yeah. And this is quite complex, just because I think what we're still sort of dancing around too is that so much of how people socialize now is online, right? We just went through this huge pandemic where, like I mentioned, working with kids, that's sort of where socializing was, right? And already sort of has been for people our age as well. And so I think, speaking to that sort of complexity, there is, it reminded me of, I think it's Kurt Vonnegut, who's like a writer. Yeah, well, he had this sort of, this is writing specific, but I think it goes for other things, this sort of exercise where he would ask people to write like a short story, or write a poem, or write something that they wanted to write, and work on it until they really, really liked it and they thought it was done, and then like destroy it, like tear it up or burn it or get rid of it. And the act of creation, or enjoy doing a process with yourself for its own sake, right? Without having to, you know, imagine an audience, or without having to imagine or worry about the perception of someone else, right? And I think that can be huge in how we think about people using social media to disclose things. But what can it be like to sort of disclose something for the sake of yourself, or journaling, right? I mean, this is something I ask clients to do all the time, but that it is really huge to want to verbalize or express something without the fear of, how is this going to be received? How is this going to be perceived, right? Where I think when people are more vulnerable in social media, there still is this awareness of, who's going to see this? You know, how are they going to respond to me, right? Are there ways in which that I'm expressing myself that might be too much? So I'm going to temper this, right? As opposed to, I want to have a genuine form of expression for the sake of that sort of genuine expression. And so, to your point about boundaries, I think they're really, really hard for people to navigate. But I think what we recognize is there comes a point where, if it's becoming distressing to how we're able to show up or be vulnerable in other spaces, that's significant, right?
I love what you said about, if it's distressing. And so, like, if you even unpack that word, it's like dis, which is like the opposite of, and then stress, which is like the stressing. It's like when you exercise, you actually pull apart the muscle. And so if you feel pulled apart and far from safe and not yourself, it probably means that that is not something that is appropriate to share in this moment. That's really good. I was listening to this like TED Talk, and like one of the things that the speaker said was, there are things that happened to me 10 years ago that I'm not sharing with the world yet, just because it's mine to process right now. And I found that like really refreshing, that there were things that someone wasn't ready to share yet, but they were vulnerable about what they were and were not willing to share. That's really good.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's huge. And that specific point made me think about two different pieces where I've worked with bereavement and queer identity, two very, very different things, but two things that sometimes there are social expectations for how we disclose or talk about them, or when we disclose or talk about them. I was thinking when you said that 10 years piece, where socially, at least in this country, I think grief comes with an expectation of it's getting over it, right? And how long does it take you to get over it, right? And we know that's not really how grief works, right? A lot of grief is much more about how do I move forward with this person? How do I carry their memory? Or how do I sort of honor that and process what's coming up for me, right? We can't really put a timeline or expectation on any individual for that. And I think the same is true of queer identity. I think there's a lot of social pressure to be like, when are you going to be out? And what are you sort of out as? And how do you present and identify and do this and do that? In a way that is, what I'm speaking to is for an audience, right? Is less about how that person shows up or wants to be expressive or wants to identify, but a sort of pressure to figure out, how do I need people to perceive me if I'm going to be explicit about this identity? Which can be really, really difficult in how we figure out, how we navigate that, right? And then there's also a timeline that gets put on that too, where people sort of expect, it's taking me too long to sort of feel at peace with my identity or fully understand it. And I think in working with queer identifying people who are having trouble feeling like a concreteness in their identity, a huge part is that's okay, right? Part of life is that growth, or part of life is that tolerance of it's okay not to know all the time, or to change your mind, or to be unsure, or to not tell people, or to not disclose. And I think the way that we've come to expect things sometimes have to be disclosed, right? It's a bit of a gray area, but I've noticed that that's something that does come up for a lot of people that I work with.
It's interesting how these concepts of hyper-awareness, vulnerability, bereavement, and queerness are different topics that we're talking about, but they kind of have this underlying theme of self-awareness and understanding about what you are and are not ready for. And I think that one of the things that I'm familiar with is bereavement. And I've had clients before where they've struggled with accepting that they're not in acceptance yet. And I think queerness also comes with that level of awareness as well, because there is a grief of relinquishing this perceived identity you think you should show up as. And one of the things that I've done before in helping other people navigate queerness and what that means for them is narrative therapy. And I don't know if you've done that with clients before, Khai, but it's almost like the understanding of what's the story underneath this, and what beliefs are created out of this narrative that you've crafted. It's almost like a form of acting. And then at some point you're done with the acting, you're done having to hold your breath and having to hold everything inside of you. Because I want to speak to that right now too, for someone that's listening to this and struggling with that boundary and struggling to accept where they are in their journey. How would you help them, just practical tips of embracing the gray area that they might be in right now?
Yeah. That's a great question. And it reminded me of, I'm not the first person to make this point, I think, but in Toni Morrison's book, Sula, Sula's a character who, makes some hard choices. Namely, she sleeps with her best friend's husband, which is very controversial, right? I guess I'm going to spoil Sula for people. So here's your spoiler alert. But there comes a point where Sula's on her deathbed, and Nell, I believe, comes in and is you did all these things, you made all these horrible mistakes, and you're unsure, and you did all these questionable things, and less decisive than Nell's character is. And Nell asks, what do you have to show for it, right? And Sula says, show to who, right? And I think to me, that was a really, really transformative moment where it's not always easy, but I'm not responsible to prove the sort of the grayness of what's going on for me, or my mistakes or my choices, right? I'm not responsible to anyone for that. And I think for so many people who are in that gray area about, whether it's about identity in terms of their queerness, or, in a gray area about their career choices or their family arrangement or how they feel about themselves in life, it can be huge, I think, to want to give yourself space and perspective and some of that mindfulness to feel like I don't owe anything to this sense of pressure that I feel, right? That's a huge thing that I enjoy doing in therapies. We look at where people's sort of expectations come from, right? That I'm not supposedly doing enough. Well, says who, right? I need to, be over this already. Says who, right? And what does it mean to take down our resistance to how we're feeling and accept it and be okay that we're in grief or we're in a gray area or we don't know, right? That we don't have to make a decision. I think that can be really huge for a lot of people.
Take down the resistance. That takes a huge level of reflection and self-awareness and honesty to be able to tell the truth about how you're doing.
Yeah.
I have a really silly story that came up for me where growing up, I had an elderly lady that lived across the street from me, Pat. And one of the things that she used to tell me when I first started dating, I think I had like a date lined up and I wasn't sure about it. And she said to me, I noticed that you're using this, and I'm pointing to my head a lot, but you should be using this, your heart, because your feelings never lie. Your feelings never lie. And I remember, I actually called up this boy and I was like, I don't think I feel right going on this date with you. And like, long story short, it ended up being for my good. But I share this story because I think there are different layers that come with our identity, that come with being Asian, that come with, for me, being an immigrant, growing up like in different levels of socioeconomic status. And I think that sometimes we can get caught up with all of these conflicting thoughts about who we need to prove things to. But I think going back to like Sula, what you were talking about, there is this inner confidence that comes with knowing what the story is and like where that's coming from. That's really good, Khai.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it can be huge to sort of but I think what we're acknowledging is that it's not necessarily easy, of course. I think it's very, very easy to struggle or for those feelings to come back, and it's an ongoing process, right? What the narrative we construct is, and then also how we give ourselves that space, especially when we have intersecting identities that sometimes, based on what social parameters we live in, put pressure on certain people more than it does on other people for different reasons, right?
Yeah.
And to have certain lived experiences means that it's harder sometimes for certain people to feel comfortable with that, which is something I'm totally comfortable acknowledging, but it doesn't necessarily make some of this easier. I just think it makes it important for people to be able to recognize and be curious about and want to give themselves that space.
Yeah, it comes with, I love the way that you're presenting all of this, because it comes with a level of understanding what your privilege is, knowing where you're feeling a lack of acceptance and being able to sit with those emotions. And I think that takes a lot of work for, I can only speak for myself. It's taken a lot of work for me, because I feel like we're going back full circle to the beginning of our conversation, where I think throughout your life as a child, you're taught to change constantly. I'll work on that, or that's not okay to say. things are so structured and so black and white. Then you graduate, or you pick a college, or you pick a major, and things don't feel concrete like they used to anymore. And so you have to like pull the pieces together, and you have to figure everything out. Yeah, it's kind of weird that way, how like we graduate school and then we were told to just figure it out from there when we've been given like a clear roadmap.
Yeah.
And so it really does take a lot of confidence to say, okay, says who? Who says that I, like, you know, cultural standards, I should be married by now, or I should have kids by now, you know? So yeah, there's all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that made me think about is a lot of what we talk about, I'm wary about sounding too individualistic, where what we're talking about is also that these are shared feelings, right? Among most, if not all people, that we have things that we're insecure about, or we're not super confident in areas where we feel like we have to do more to prove ourselves, or we experience imposter syndrome, and we worry am I being a good enough parent or child or sibling or partner or whatever that is, right? And I think the way that we're metabolizing this, if we feel like, oh, this is my responsibility, is, I think for a lot of people, especially people I work with, and sometimes for myself, I feel like I'm the only person feeling that way, right? And it can be so validating and give you a sense of reassurance to realize, hey, there are days where so-and-so shows up at work and they also feel like, what am I doing, right? Or there are also friends of mine, or a sibling or a friend who's like, yeah, sometimes I don't know what I'm doing as a parent. That's how it feels. Or I don't know what I'm doing as, you know, an employee or a teacher or whatever it might be. That it can be huge to have some recognition that these doubts or these concerns about how we're perceived are not unique to us inherently, or not alone, I should say, as opposed to unique, but not ours alone, right? And it's not something that we have to necessarily carry on our own, but it can mean a lot for a community to acknowledge, you know, we're all experiencing the effects of this, or we're all, you know, sharing in this struggle, right? I think that can be huge for people too.
But what are some things that you felt comfort in and admitting about feeling alone with? Does that question make sense?
You cut out.
Did I cut off? No, it's okay. It's okay. So I'll reframe my question and tell you a story. So I recently went through an existential crisis with who I was as a person, because the perfectionism was gone, after healing through burnout, etc., and having these really healthy established practices. And so one day I get off of work, and usually when I'm done with work, there is this like looming cloud of stress that is like a Rolodex in my mind of, I didn't do this and I didn't do that and I have to do this, and you know, da 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 da. It's like it wasn't there anymore. And I ended up calling up one of my friends, Megan, and I was like, I don't know what to do with my life anymore. Like, I don't have perfectionist tendencies. Who am I outside of this? And there was something that she said that kind of didn't make me feel better, but it made me feel understood. And through that understanding, I felt better about myself, where it wasn't really the words, but it was her saying, oh, me too. Like, I went through that when I was your age. She's like 5 years older than me. And she started telling me all of these things that she experienced at that moment in time. And I guess my question was, before we got like cut off by the internet, was, what is one thing that you've gone to people for that just made you feel better about sharing that experience with them?
I think a really easy one that still happens is a sense of burnout, or a sense of maybe imposter syndrome isn't accurate, but doubting certain lifestyle choices that have led me to where I am, right? I think part of that I don't know, part of that existential crisis is like, what does the rest of my life sort of look like, right? How have I set up things for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
And, had I spoken to that mentor, or had I done that thing, would things have been, magically
Yeah.
different, or whatever, however we frame that. And I think a
Yeah.
huge thing that has been validating for me is feeling like it's okay to make mistakes, or it's okay not to know, right? It's not perfect every time, but sometimes not knowing means that there's not a right or a wrong choice. There's just the next one, right? It's just whatever I'm about to do next, right? When you were sharing about sort of feeling like, when I get to a place where I can sort of feel like, okay, well, I guess I can accept, not wanting that pressure of having to do something. There's that feeling of like, what am I supposed to do, right, with my life, or what am I supposed to do? And that reminded me, early on, I had a mentor who talked about, and I know this sounds maybe a little bit cheesy, so let's try to metabolize it. But he was just sharing that, like, acceptance of self and comfortability with your life is not about doing, right? You don't have to do anything. You just have to be, right? And you already are. And I found that really, really important to me, because it sort of meant that in that moment where I was feeling nebulous, it was validating that I'm already doing, or rather being, all that I need to be to justify my experience or my validity as a person. And there doesn't need to be an urgency towards, what's that next thing, or what am I supposed to do now? But, take it back, right? Maybe I'm okay with just being this, right? And maybe more importantly as well, if you're really curious about that, there's a difference between what should I do as opposed to, well, what do you want to do, right? You have that freedom. You have that space to go. Helen, you've made this acceptance. What feels like a good use of your time, a fun use of your time? Yeah, and getting more curious about what feels satisfying to yourself.
Yeah. That's really good. That's really good. The reason why I say that is because there are things that our gut knows that our brain can never comprehend. I remember my neighbor Bruce was telling me this story about how he was driving his car and he had this like knowing, like almost like a gut feeling to not move forward with the car. And he was in the car with his friend that was pregnant and her husband. And he stops there and he just waits one millisecond, 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds. And this car speeding at 150 miles an hour just like drives by. And just like at the moment he could have crossed that light, the car would have hit them and they would have died. Yeah. And I think of that story when you share that, because there are things that might not make sense in this threshold of life, but it's okay that you mess up and that you make mistakes. Like, it's actually part of the process. And you never really hear that growing up. Like, it's like, what are you going to do when you're older? How are you going to make that happen? How are you going to pay off your debt? What are you going to do? Yeah. Like, what if something happens? Do you have 6 months worth of savings? It's like, there's so much cultural messaging about being prepared and about knowing that sometimes being able to sit with the feeling and go, my gut is telling me this, even though the rest of society is telling me that I should be this way or I should go this direction. Do you have a story like that, Khai, where you just followed your gut?
That's a really great question. I think the first thought that I had is, for anyone who cares about, validating sort of what we're talking about, a literal sort of level, your gut does have like parts of your nervous system in it, so you can literally trust your gut. But I guess in that sense, I think a lot of it has to do with more presently just wanting to trust the circumstances that I've created for myself. I'm very aware of a lot of people, myself included, who sometimes have doubts about, what the next thing we're working towards is, or unsureness of the future, at the threshold that we can't see past, right? And I think a really illuminating point is that there are so many things that I've grown complacent and comfortable with right now, that a month ago, a year ago, 5 years ago were things that I didn't think I could achieve, or I was really, really stressed about, right? You know, for the longest time growing up, like lots of people, I wasn't sure about what college would look like. I wasn't sure about what grad school could be like, if it was a possibility. I wasn't sure about, my confidence in my identity in a lot of ways that I currently am, right? These are things that I kind of take for granted. And when you mentioned sort of narrative therapy as well, it got me thinking, like, that's a huge piece that I think so much forward thinking and anxiety and unsureness about what lies in our future does to us is we lose sight of just how far we've brought ourselves, right? Just how much we've already done and how much we've struggled through and how much we have to be proud of ourselves in a certain moment, right? That there were things that were a challenge last week that are no longer a challenge because you did that. And I think that can be really, really huge to then wanting to trust. I've demonstrated to myself that I can make the things that are important to me in the future happen. I've done it, every day of my life so far, right? So this next one is just the next one, right?
Are you talking about work and the stresses with
Sure.
working at a new job?
Yeah, work is a great example just because for our listeners, I guess I'm relatively new in Yellow Chair, right? And there can be a sort of newfound anxiety in a new workspace. I'll speak to myself personally of wanting to understand the work culture and wanting to understand my peers and how things are done. That sort of feels like a reset sometimes of like, oh, I guess all of a sudden I don't know anything, which ignores like, hey, I had an interview process to get here. They're qualified, right? I have a resume of previous work in this field, at a similar organization in a different area, right? I have my degree. I have this experience. I have this mentorship. I have this training, right? Which were all in and of themselves things at one point that I didn't feel sure about, right? And so it can be really, really huge to focus on that. And give yourself that space to go, hey, for me, right, that this thing is just the next thing, right? Working with Yellow Chair, working with a fantastic colleague like Helen is just the next piece of my professional trajectory. That's a long part of the rest of what I've done so far.
There's so much anxiety that comes with like having a career, and one of the things I'm really grateful for, and I've told Sujin and Linda this, who are like the co-directors of YCC, that I came into this job with a lot of pressure on myself. And like I read the new Where I Belong book, and there is this pressure for like Asian excellence. And like for the first time in my life, I'm working with an all Asian American staff, and there's this like need to not prove yourself, and there's never any microaggressions, and the ones you put on yourself, we get called out for that. And so it's like such a different experience. I don't know if you experience this, Khai, but I've experienced a profound level of spiritual growth, being able to just not having to explain my existence and my presence. I don't know, I don't know what it's like for you, but I feel like it's just an exhale of not being able to like have that pressure on myself.
Yeah. Well, it's been really nice to find that sort of feeling at Yellow Chair, but I've been very, very fortunate where my previous working experience was also at a predominantly Asian professionals, focusing
awesome.
focusing on an Asian population. They're in the Bay, particularly working in schools. But I do remember that feeling that you're talking about, right?
How?
Showing up and feeling like I was already taken seriously. I didn't have to explain parts of my how I conceptualize things or how I show up in certain spaces, right? There was an open sort of trust. There was an open source of shared awareness of these experiences, right? And I'm sure this is something you found, but that can go a long way also for us, working with people who are, also Asian identifying of, our clients don't have to prove anything to us. And hopefully they can trust that, right? Again, this is sort of painting with a broad brush, but
Right.
I do find that that's been really, really helpful. And for me, just in this field, yeah, working at Yellow Chair, there has been a sense of trust in myself that has been really, really profound and I think really, really special. That makes it easier for me to just focus on the work and trust what I'm doing, as opposed to, having to prove something or point at a bottom line and go, that's what I did, and that's where we're good, or we're meeting certain expectations, or whatever it is. I can spend much more time focusing on, am I curating really, really good relationships with the people that I'm working with? Like, do I have really, really good trust and comfortability with the clients who've chosen to work with me, right? Am I honoring their stories? Am I coming alongside them effectively? Am I meeting them where they're at?
I love this perspective around work. Do I have good relationships? And that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Like when I talk to friends, there's always this like looming discussion about money and benefits. And all of those things are actually really legitimate because making enough money is important.
Sure. Yeah.
But what makes work sustainable is the type of relationships you have with your coworkers and whether or not something is valuable to you. But I think it always goes back to your perception of yourself and what you think you deserve. But I think these questions around how can I really build a great foundation with who I choose to work with and the people that I do work with as coworkers, that's really profound.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit with that we work in the same workplace, but I'm still going to sit with that. Anyways.
Yeah.
Khai, I want to end with one more question because I want to be respectful of your time. What's one thing that you've learned this year, and it's only been like a month and a half into this new year, but what's one thing that you didn't know about yourself before that you know more about now?
That is a great question. Maybe this would feel more obvious to you or to lots of people. But I think for me, something that I learned about myself this year, even in the short couple months, is I really, really need connection. And I mean that with like loved ones and family and friends. I think that's the stuff that makes life meaningful for me, that makes life sort of worth it, to put it really, really simply. And I think I really, really value the community that I find in friends in terms of how we share our experiences, how we share our relationships and our lives with each other. With family, a huge piece is getting to see them and feel connected to them and feel like I'm showing up as a part of the tapestry of my family. And in my friendships and relationship, wanting to be present with them, right? I think that is really, really recharging for me. I think it's very, very easy sometimes in moments where I'm feeling anxious or feeling that sort of pressure that we're talking about, to feel like, okay, well, I've got to go off on my own and do my own thing, and then I'll feel better. But what I've noticed feels way more important to me is having a sense of community and connection that validates when I'm not feeling 100%, instead of feeling like, oh, if I go do 4 tasks on my to-do list, I'll manifest that feeling. Like, but to search for connection, to reach out, to be open to that, to want to hold space for others and trust that the loved ones that I have will hold that space for me. I think that's been really important for me to grow more and more comfortable and recognize.
That's so good. I'm learning that lesson too, that you can't live life alone, that there are certain things in life that are just better with other people and not just with yourself.
Yeah.
That's so good. Khai, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for doing this again with me. Listener, we recorded before and I was not in a headspace to record, so Khai was gracious enough to record with me, but thank you for going over by 15 minutes.
Of course.
And Yellow Chair Collective was not recorded in front of a live studio audience. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe if you found value to this episode.